Our next speakers are from Iowa Department of Natural Resources. They are both foresters with that agency. Sarah Rueger spent some time in college on county conservation before working as a contract forester with Iowa DNR. In March, she moved to Western Iowa as a district forester and spends most of her time working with private landowners to improve their timbers. Lindsey Barney is also with Iowa DNR and has been with them for a long time, 11 years now, originally covering portions of Western Iowa and now covering 11 counties in Southwest Iowa. Lindsey's primary interests are in oak fire ecology and agroforestry. So I will spotlight the two of them and hand it over to the two of you to tell us a little bit about the sort of management recommendations that you're giving your stakeholders when they're facing bur oak blight or other problems that we've mentioned today. Thanks for joining us today, ladies.
Thanks for having us.
You bet, you bet. So let me know if you're having any screen share issues and you are good to go.
Yeah, for some reason it won't let me share my video, but hopefully it'll let me share my screen so I can run the slides.
Wonderful. Let's see. I've got you as co-hosts already, so you should be good to go on screen share. Excellent. And then change those display settings to duplicate. There you go.
Okay, is that looking good for everyone?
Yeah, it looks great, and we can hear you wonderful, Lindsey.
Okay, well, thanks for the introduction. We're just gonna flip back and forth between these slides as we go through, and a lot of this will be real case studies, dancing around all the topics that Dr. Harrington just presented on, and it's kind of cool to get to hear him again. I'm a student, Sarah was probably a student, so we learned a lot from him, so that's really cool to come back full circle. But just to emphasize how important oak management is to us all throughout Iowa, but especially the Less Hills where Sarah and I work. You can see this map to the right shows where we've been changing cover types over the last 150 plus years of settlement. Oak hickory forest encompasses 37% of our forest cover, and obviously we all know for mostly foresters and urban foresters that it's highly important. Some of our statistics from the state say that we've been losing 7,000 acres of oak hickory forest annually to conversion to other uses, or even more problematic is conversion to other forest types from lack of management or from diseases like we've been talking about. So Dr. Harrington gave us a great segue into this, talking about fire and other disturbances, how they played a role in forest stand dynamics, especially with bur oak. This is just kind of a reiteration of kind of how traditional oak management happens, or how our natural disturbances would have mimicked this set of stand dynamics. And as he alluded to, especially with bur oak, they need a tremendous amount of sunlight to be recruited into the overstory. And if those natural disturbances aren't around to do that for us, sometimes we have to mimic these with silviculture. And that's kind of what we'll be talking about today, the success stories of, at least on our side of the river, of what we've seen work and what hasn't worked.
Is this me, Lindsey?
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, everyone. We haven't presented this in two separate offices before, so we'll do our best to keep the flow going. But as Dr. Harrington touched on really well earlier, we know that without the natural disturbance and without those natural regimes, The forests that we have now are pretty over mature. There's really no diversity in the age class. We don't have that desirable oak hickory regeneration. It's a lot of mixed hardwood species like cherry, elm, and mulberry, on and on. These over mature forests are often really packed in together, and they're crowded, and because of this, disease runs rampant and decline runs rampant, as do the invasive plants sometimes in the mid-story and understory. So there's just a general overall stagnation, and the function of these mature oak timbers is just not what it should be. So Lindsey has this note in here that I like. Forest management is kind of like a game of chess. You have to be thinking ahead before you make a move, because one wrong move can set you back a lot further than you were before and make the situation quite a bit worse. So just a random question. What age bracket of forests are most resilient to extreme windstorms or disturbance like that? And that's foreshadowing, because we're going to touch on that later.
So Sarah gets to see a lot more of this now, because this is what the northern Loess Hills look like a lot, and the southern Loess Hills too. But we were talking about stagnation, second growth trees that have been logged before. We could go on for probably half an hour about how Iowa's woodlands were used in settlement and cut over several times. For some were just not cut and never managed, or were pastured. So I think I've heard Dr. Harrington talk about this before, but site history has a big impact on the current health of a lot of our forests. And this picture is just reiterating what, we can kind of glean from the site just by looking at how the structure is. I'll let you go with this, Sarah.
All right, so it's easy to talk about what's wrong with our woodlands now, but it is important to focus on the end goal, and what we want to manage for is a healthy woodland. Why does it matter? Because healthy woodlands are more resistant to disease, they are capable of regenerating, and they maximize environmental services, countless environmental services. So unfortunately, we don't see a whole lot of that anymore. A lot of our woodlands are that classic, overcrowded, overmature stands, and they are disappearing from the landscape at a pretty alarming rate. So that being said, all of the woodlands that we have left, even those very highly parcelized groves within municipalities and whatnot, those are critically important for us to manage now. So where do you start? Well, there is no one answer, because every stand is different. And the way we go about this is for Lindsey and I, we encourage landowners to reach out to us, and we will meet with them at the site, map and get a detailed inventory on the forest resource. We'll look at adjacent timbers if we can, and identify threats, what's going on with the timber. Is there disease? Are there invasives, etc.? And then one of the most important things is that we discuss with the landowner what are their goals, because we need to be able to play off of their goals and their passions about the timber to achieve the end goal of a healthy stand. So one of the things that we'll talk about with them is what treatment options are there. And then most importantly, what kind of resources are we working with? How far financially can they go? If they're not going to do the work, can they hire a contractor to do it? All that stuff's important, because it's really easy to take a big bite and get a lot of work done and then not be able to do the follow-up work. It's just one of those things that I think folks don't initially anticipate when they take on the task of managing a woodland. And sometimes after all of that, we get to a point where we have to ask, is the best management here to do nothing? And oftentimes that is the case. There's a lot of big timbers around here where it kind of looks the same across 300 acres. And if the landowner is not able to tackle that, either they pick a very small part to work with that they can follow up with, or they just leave it as it is.
So these are actual photos from a couple different sites that are relatively close proximity down here in the Southern Hills, just illustrating those last points. So first photo on the left shows what you'd consider a typical savanna restoration on a ridge top. And right on the right side of the screen, you see the same thing, a traditional savanna restoration, but the landowner unfortunately didn't have any follow-up done or post-treatments or any monitoring for the last 20 years. And those little trees you see in the foreground all around that big wolf oak tree are amber cork tree and tree of heaven, which are really bad invasives in the Southern Hills. Everything south of Council Bluffs is pretty highlighted by tree of heaven in particular. So that's why we keep, if we could say anything out of this whole presentation, like only bite off as much as you can handle, or there's some silvicultural things you can do to lessen the impact of sunlight all of a sudden, and that will also hopefully lessen the impacts of invasive plants. So this is going way back to silviculture class for any of you that took it, but this is like a classic mixed age stand in the Loess Hills. And if we were going to use the Shelterwood burn method, which is pretty common throughout the eastern part of the United States, you might do a mid-story thinning, then you might do an overstory thinning depending on if the overstory's overstocked, which sometimes, especially in the northern hills where it's cut over second growth bur oak, it's going to be overstocked anyway. So you might have to do an overstory and mid-story removal to get you down to the proper density. And these are actual photo points from some fire effects plots we did in the Loess Hills, all up and down the hills. So you'll get to see these series to show you the different treatments and the results over 3 years. But we, in this particular site that this photo is going to show, we mimicked that burn Shelterwood method. The reason we did it is we were losing the overstory to bur oak blight and oak wilt on this ridge top. And the neat thing is we had advanced regeneration already in place, which is pretty unusual for the Loess Hills. We really struggle to get oak recruitment at all, which is kind of different from South Central Iowa, where I work more now. Plenty of oak regeneration most of the time, but in the Loess Hills, for whatever reason, it's very unusual to have it already in place, like this site shows. So what it's showing is we had plenty of ironwood competition for our young oaks, and we needed to do something about that. So before thinning, there was a prescribed fire, and after thinning, there was a prescribed fire. So these are the results after the second one, after it's been thinned. And yes, it top killed some of the oaks, but they're adapted to that, and that lower picture shows them sprouting right back. And here's another plug from us. I have a heavy interest in fire, but at the same time, I think there's ways that we can manipulate what we can control to lessen the impacts of fire on these trees we're trying to protect and manage for. And these are all photos from the hills, real live sites. The top left one here is a savanna restoration where they took out cedar, removed all the cedar, burned it on a hot spring day, and it literally top killed full-size oak trees. That is not necessary. There's fuel manipulations, weather manipulations, fuel moisture, there's all kinds of things you can adjust to make sure that doesn't happen. This photo on the right shows an area where a tornado went through and severely damaged this whole section of the northern hills. And they did a follow-up burn in this area on a drought year, and it severely impacted the oaks in that vicinity too. Again, there's ways we can mitigate that. And then the lower left shows kind of a classic area of what happens in the Loess Hills if you slick off all the cedar in a restoration activity, or you do this in a savanna restoration activity and you walk away and leave a bare site, especially on a fertile bottom ground like this is, you're going to get tree of heaven. That's one thing we kind of have to plan for. So but Sarah and I are always looking for these, what are our worst enemies in the scenario, and trying to work back from that to see if we can make the best of all worlds without ruining the forest. So these are a series of photos. So I just gave you some things to think about for as we're walking through these. If you're trying to minimize fuel loading, which of these treatments would work best for that? If you're trying to minimize vegetative response to sunlight, which ones would be good for that? Which ones would lessen the impact of invasive plant spread? And which are most likely to recruit young oak? So this is these are photos, and you can see the year that they were taken. The dormant season photos are showing when the plots were installed and before treatment, basically. And then GS means growing season, and then you can see the treatment that happened in the year. This was mechanically thinned savanna restoration, and they used fire in the fall in this particular example. So you can see they've had some pretty good vegetative response. This is another example, Central Hills, where they did mid-story thinning and they did a spring fire. You can see that's a little bit different forest type, less oak savanna and more like true, mixed hardwood type situation, but still really good understory response. This one is an example where, again, they maintain it for open woodland and they use annual fire. This is the site where I was showing you pictures from the Shelterwood burn message. So these are during the treatment years. So this is the 2015 is after the first treatment. We had to follow up and retreat that same unit because that particular herbicide was diluted with the local well water and it deactivated the herbicide. So we had to retreat that unit. So that's why you're seeing it twice. Then there was fire before and after in this situation, and we got pretty good oak recruitment in this situation, but there was also oak recruitment there. And that's why we chose to release it with that Shelterwood method. This is a little bit further south in the hills. These were, this was a traditional savanna cutting where everything except for chinkapin oak was cut. So there's an extreme amount of fuel and trees on the ground. And you can see through the years the kind of pretty extreme vegetative response that these managers received. But they still got that open canopy they were looking for. And just as a comparison, in the same unit, this was, again, same ultimate goal, but they treated it with mid-story removal thinning using hack and squirt. And it's just a slower release to get them the same goal. So I'll give that back to Sarah now.
So yeah, just looking at Lindsey's work on some of those case studies there, it kind of helps get you thinking about what would you want to do to slowly let light back into the understory? What kind of things can we do to limit that fuel loading to prevent damage to the mature oak overstory? How do we reduce those unwanted flushes in vegetation after we do the initial management? And are we helping or hurting our chances of recruiting young oaks? So it's just, that's where the chess note comes back in. You want to be thinking ahead about what the management you do now is going to result in. So a question that sometimes gets asked is harvesting an option? Well, there's a bunch of different situations where harvesting is a fantastic tool in regards to oak management. So especially here in the Luss Hills, when we have a lot of tightly packed, stunted, poor form oaks, disease gets in there, and if oak wilt comes through a stand like that, you're rapidly losing the overstory. That would be a good situation where you might want to take out the logs while they're still merchantable and get that new generation growing. Yeah, just those stagnant overstocked Lux Hills stands. If there's oak decline from general site history, if there was a pasturing that took place for decades, you might see that die back in the decline of the overstory, and that might be a good situation to log. So there's a handful of situations where this is useful. The big thing to hit on with landowners is that it's more than just the harvest, though. Especially if they're harvesting for an ecological purpose. And Lindsey, you can change the slide there. So it's really important that the landowner understands there is quite a bit of follow-up work after the harvest. They need to have clear direction on what the post-harvest site prep is going to look like to prepare the ground for the seedlings. They need to know what the actual process will be for planting the seedlings and then maintaining. There's quite a bit of long-term maintenance in a planting like this. You can't run fire through it yet or else you're going to melt the tubes. And so they need to stay on top of mechanical or chemical treatment of whatever invasives or undesirable species that come up and are going to be competing with those seedlings. So landowners often find themselves wondering, oh, should I harvest? Well, sometimes nature decides for you. So this is something I wanted to touch on because A, it's where most of my experience has been so far, but also because this can happen to any of us. In this case, it happened in central and east central Iowa, but nobody saw it coming. It took 5 minutes, and it can happen to anybody in Nebraska or here in Western Iowa too. So this is what you just saw was the effects from the 2020 derecho. You can see on the map, it was just kind of a swath across central, east central Iowa. And in the worst parts, there were sustained winds of over 120 miles per hour. So before I move on with that, I just wanted to real quickly touch on resilience. So the derecho provided a fantastic recurring theme for us on how a young stand holds up versus an old stand in this kind of a disturbance. So this is a 20 to 30-year-old oak stand immediately after the derecho. You can see on the left and right there, the red trees are the oaks. They are pretty unscathed and the stand is still intact. This picture is from a mature oak stand. It's 120 acres just outside of Marion, and it experienced 100% canopy loss across the entire 120 acres. So this was completely devastating, and that's the most extreme example. But that's the case across all stands where the derecho hit. Even if they were mixed stands with a mixed hardwood mid-story, the storm picked off those overstory oaks in all stand types. And that's just devastating because now it's gone. In a matter of minutes, that overstory is gone. And as we all know, we don't have the regeneration to back that up. So going back, what do you do if you find yourself in a situation like this? A tornado or a storm has ravaged your timber. What now? Well, the first step is to assess. And what we found after the derecho is that initially, when there were still leaves on the trees, it looked really, really bad. Almost like there was nothing that could be done. But when fall and winter came around, we lost the leaves and we could really see what we were working with. It became apparent that there is some management that can be done even in these totally devastated stands. So one of the most popular forms of management for folks in the derecho area was to salvage log. And it was so popular that loggers couldn't even take any more logs because they didn't know what else to do with the logs they had. But the purpose of this is to kind of restore access back into the timber. It's not going to clean it up as many people would want, but it'll help restore access so that landowners or land managers can then go in and do follow-up work like staying on top of invasives and interplanting like you see in this picture off to the right. Another method is to further what the storm did and push a Shelterwood system. So that one's a little bit trickier. You can imagine a landowner's face when you tell them they could go in and kill more trees than the derecho did. But that seemed to make the most sense for some of those stands where, 50% of the canopy was gone. And if we could just get rid of a little more, then we have those good light conditions, a good Shelterwood condition to get new seedlings in the ground. But the biggest challenge for folks with storm damaged timbers like this, I believe, is going to be to watch the invasives. Because we all know how they like to colonize in disturbed areas, and this is a massively disturbed area, huge swath of land. So I think that's going to be tough for a lot of people to stay on top of that. And that's where we go back to, can we salvage log? Can we get some of this out of the way, just so that we can get into the woods and actually do that management?
Yeah, this photo, like, just gonna emphasize in the Loess Hills anyway, this isn't involving oak per se, but it could. The photo you're seeing is where walnut had been high graded out of valley bottoms, which is super, super common in the Loess Hills, and you can retroactively repair sites like that. And that's what this photo is showing, is rehabilitating a site that's been overlogged or high graded in the past, and return it to the diversity it should have.
Lindsey, you got this one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so pretty much to wrap this all up, regardless of what kind of management we're thinking about, obviously our end goal is always a healthy timber. And to achieve that, we need to know the timber. We need to know what's going on in the neighboring timbers. It's important to know if they've got an invasive issue or anything like that. We need to understand that each timber is different and there's no one solid answer that works for every stand. We need to plan for the worst case scenario. We don't need to be afraid of things like the derecho happening, but it is a good thing to have in the back of your mind that it helps put into perspective why having that regeneration is important, because it takes minutes for something like that to happen. And we just need to understand that we can do everything right, and sometimes there are still things that happen that we couldn't do anything about. So Lindsey, I don't know if you have any closing comments there, but that's all I had.
Yeah, I think what I've learned over the last 11 years here is it seems like what gets people the results they don't want, or gets them into a scenario that's more work than they bargained for in the beginning, is too much light all of a sudden, or too drastic of treatments. So maybe just a slower pace of thinning to get you the results. I've heard some people say it took 150 years to get us to the condition we're in now, and we can't expect results in a year or two when we're doing restoration or forestry work. So I guess that's all I would say. And if you guys have any questions for us, we'll do our best to answer them.
Yeah, great stuff, Sarah and Lindsey. As you said, we play a long game when we're dealing with trees. They're long-lived organisms, and we're impatient creatures. And so you have to temper people's expectations and the time span that they're going to see the change they may be looking for there. I thought your point was really good about figuring out what the goals of the landowner are, because that's going to really inform strategy just as much as what's already happening in that forest. What's the end state that we're trying to accomplish? That really is a big factor in what your recommendations are going to be. Human intervention, some people that don't have a forestry background might be seeing this and going, well, why do we need to do all this work in the forest as people when we didn't need to before we were around? And I have my own thoughts on that, but maybe you guys could answer that rhetorical question.
No, that's a super good question. And we were kind of dancing around it, but I'm glad you brought it up so we can answer it directly. There's a whole bunch of factors that we have to deal with now that didn't exist pre-settlement. And one of the biggest ones is invasive plants. So that kind of disturbance could happen. Fire could happen, flooding could happen, tornadoes could happen and do good things for the way the forest acts. But now, if you're in close proximity to anything tenacious, like any of the plants we talked about, or honeysuckle, autumn olive, anything like that, that could be what takes over, your your well planned out silvicultural or forest management practices if you don't plan for that ahead of time now. So that is super challenging for most of us land managers to deal with, I think.
And then sort of taking the fire ecology away with the way we manage adjacent land to those forested areas, I'm sure is a factor as well. You don't have those natural, quote unquote, natural fires that come through and help, the resilience of the forest.
Right, and sometimes in urban settings especially, we've dealt with this in Council Bluffs, fire is not an option, so we've got to sometimes figure out a treatment that mimics the results of fire that isn't fire.
Right, and you even mentioned sometimes prescribing annual burns, which seems pretty aggressive, but I suppose that's a response to a long time where none of that was happening.
So that particular land manager, that's his that's the way that they manage that particular piece of land, and for their objectives. I tend to think I'm a little more hesitant to go with annual fire, mostly because of the effects on tree health, but I think there's some studies probably yet to determine that. So right. I'm just gonna say hopefully there's more research on. We need more research in Western Iowa and in Nebraska, I'm sure, for silvicultural treatments in general, and giving us more guidance on timing and frequency, that kind of thing. So
yeah, we're not blessed in Nebraska with as much acreage of savanna as you guys are, I'm sure, but facing the same challenges nonetheless. You mentioned this a little bit. Sometimes it sounds like it's not a single strategy, but we're going to do this and then we're going to switch gears in response to how the forest is going to respond to our first strategy. Is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Lindsay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So it's a working plan. We make a point to follow up with landowners at a minimum every 5 years, but if we're actively doing management, we're staying on it and following up with that landowner and going back out to the property and seeing how it responded, to make sure we act accordingly for the next move. And sometimes what we expected to happen isn't what happens. So right. It's definitely important to keep watching it after we do that initial work.
Yeah, and you also mentioned the invasives, and I know around this cemetery in the Bellevue area where you have this kind of lush component on the west side of the Missouri, they're seeing a lot of ailanthus, a lot of tree of heaven and that sort of thing coming in as well, and so we're definitely struggling with that as well and managing it as best we can. Fontanelle Forest, some of those conservation areas are definitely dealing with the invasives and how to keep them well behaved amidst everything else going on. So great stuff. I appreciate you guys sharing today. Did you guys have any parting words?
No, that's all I had.
Yeah,
excellent. Okay, good deal. Well, we'll keep right on rolling. Since we're doing these